My name is David Diana. I'm the director of the Lowcountry Mental Health Conference. And this is our second Speaker Spotlight event, which is really designed to introduce you all to some of the speakers who will be joining us this summer at the Lowcountry Mental Health Conference, July 28th through 30th in Charleston, South Carolina. And before we get started and have our conversation with Dr. James Hollis, I just want to thank some of our partners. First, Charleston Dorchester Mental Health Center and their executive director, Jennifer Roberts. They are really the founders of the Lowcountry Mental Health Conference and started this whole process some 10 years ago. Also want to thank the nonprofit Mental Health Heroes, which is really the owner of the Lowcountry Mental Health Conference and the Speaker Spotlight Series, and both of which are fundraising events for the nonprofit and the work that they're doing. Also want to thank our platinum supporter, which is Palmetto Lowcountry Behavioral Health. They are the platinum supporter for both the Spotlight Series and the conference, and they have been with us since the beginning some 10 years ago. Also want to thank Mainstream Studios, who is directing and producing all of our Speaker Spotlight events. We could not do this without their professional expertise, and want to thank Buxton Books, a local bookstore in Charleston, South Carolina, that has been very supportive of us through the years, and where you can purchase many of Dr. Hollis's books through them. So I have a series of questions that I already have prepared, some of which that have come to me from some of you. And but if you would like to ask some questions, if they come to you during this conversation, you could ask them live. There are two ways in which you can do this. The first way is through YouTube, through what you're seeing right now. Either to the right or to the bottom of the video feed is a chat feature, which you could type in questions that you may have. The one caveat to that is that you would need to have a Google account to be able to access that feature. So if you do have one, just simply log into that account, and then the chat will become functional. The other option is to simply just send us an email, and that would be info@mhheroes.com, info@mhheroes.com. And we have a team that is monitoring both the chat and the emails. And what they will do is they will text me those questions, and I'll do my best to sort of go back and forth. But we'd love to see if we can get as many questions that you may have to Dr. Hollis as possible. So having said that, let me just introduce now Dr. James Hollis. He has actually, we've been fortunate to have him join us for a couple of our conferences over the past few years, and he is going to be coming back this summer as well. He's a Jungian analyst who's in private practice in Washington, D.C. And prior to that, for some 26 years, he taught humanities at several universities before he then went and got his analytical training at the Young Institute of Zurich in Switzerland. And he has written many books. I had down here that he's written 16, which I know is probably incorrect now. And Dr. Hollis can tell me that because he's been quite busy lately with some new books. So maybe more closer to 18 or 19. He has one that just recently came out this fall of 2020 called Living Between Worlds, Finding Personal Resilience in Changing Times. And then in the early winter, or just recently of 2020, an audiobook of his was produced and released titled The Life of Meaning, Exploring Our Deepest Questions and Motivations. And in February of this year, he will be releasing a new book. I believe it's mid-February, and it's called Prisms, Reflections on This Journey We Call Life. So we're really fortunate to have him again at our conference this summer. He will be giving 2 talks. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. James Hollis. Dr. Hollis, thanks for being here.
Thank you, David. It's a privilege to be with you again. It's good to see you. And I might say, this is unsolicited, truly. You've run the best conferences I've ever attended in terms of there being well organized, things moving smoothly, and an enormous amount of teamwork goes into these conferences. So I've been very impressed, and I look forward to returning this summer.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks so much. Yeah, we have a great team. I'm just going to get right into it rather than just doing some introductions or any sort of thing like
Mhm.
that. I want to sort of dive right in. And so I have a question for you here that I've been wanting to ask. And I was reading your book, Living Between Worlds, and there was a quote that you had from Carl Jung that I found really interesting. It was called, "The greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally insoluble. They must be so, for they express the necessary polarity inherent in every self-regulating system. They can never be solved, but only outgrown." Can you tell us, like, what is Jung trying to tell us there?
Well, that's one of those many nuggets of wisdom that we're all still unpacking decades later. Um, it's based on the recognition that the core issues of life stay with us. People think, well, I had this experience in my life and I can get beyond that, or I can get it behind me, or even cut it out of my life. But everything's recorded in us at the neurological level and at the emotional level. And you can see how these things keep showing up in our dreams and perhaps even more importantly, in our behaviors. The critical question I always ask of those circumstances is, given what's going on intrapsychically, what does that make you do? What does that keep you from doing? And that's when we begin to get down to the practical dimensions of this psychological project. And we realize the core issues of life are not solvable because they keep coming up in new situations. But the things that dominated you in the past, that caused those stuck places, those fixations, you can outgrow. And you can learn to absorb them into a larger system. The psyche becomes more commodious, if you will. It can take in more. I mean, this is part of the gift of relationships. Part of what relationship brings to us is the otherness of the other. And as we absorb the experience of the other, we become larger ourselves. And so I've seen so many people, and I'm sure our therapists in the audience feel this way too, who've said, "Oh, I'm so angry at myself. I'm chagrined. I thought I got beyond the situation and it popped up again." Or I wound up screaming at my mother on the phone the other day and I know better, and so forth. Well, because that material is always present. It's psychoactive. There's no time or space in the psyche. It's always present. So when triggered, then we began to realize, okay, but now I'm bringing a larger perspective to that. And yes, every time it knocks me down, I recover sooner. I recognize, oh, that's what that's about. Rather than being owned by it, as we might have been at some earlier stage of our journey, we recognize it. We climb out of that hole sooner and we begin to move forward with our lives. But it's a paradox because people project upon us as therapists some notion of cure because they're operating perhaps out of the medical model, where you're either diseased or you're cured. This is more an ongoing dialogue with our own history, an ongoing sort of engagement with the nature of the intrapsychic stories that we all carry within us. And in some ways, you might say therapy is really a kind of interrogation of those stories. So we begin to say, all right, what are the stories in you that are producing these patterns in your life? We don't rise in the morning and say, well, today I'm going to do the same stupid counterproductive things, but chances are we will. So we began to recognize, all right, there are some intrapsychic clusters of energy that I need to become more aware around because they can be triggered and take over as a kind of shadow government, if you will. And when that happens, you see, I'm a prisoner of of our history. We're pulled out of this moment and brought back into history. So you can see that that dialogue is not just sort of introspection or even self-indulgence in some way. It's really getting at some of the engines that are running our lives. So let me move on to another question because I could keep going on this theme, but I'm sure you have some other thoughts in
Well,
mind.
yeah, just related to that, because as you were speaking, I mean, when I came to the book and just exhausted by everything going on here, that was going on in 2020 and now, I had this view of, oh, I'm going to look at this in in between times, and I'm gonna find the answer, and so these things that are within me will then subside and be gone. And what I realized is, you mentioned this concept of the journey as our home, and
Mhm,
so I guess, how do you move someone, and you've alluded to some of this, from this idea of victimhood to engagement from
mhm.
where they are?
Well, first of all, a lot of people thought that book was written in response to the COVID disaster that we've been living through. It was actually finished 2 years ago, long before any of us knew that that existed. In fact, it didn't at that point, because we're always in some way in a situation of transition. Our bodies are changing every moment. Cells are dying, and cells are being reproduced, and so forth. I hate to say at a slowing rate, by the way, once you're about 26 years old, but we're always living in between what we've understood and what life is bringing us. And so it's in those moments that we will feel the greatest stress, the greatest anxiety, the greatest tendency to regress and start to reestablish the old order, as it were. And so part of what we have to learn to do, all of us, is to abide those in-betweens. They happen to us personally, but they happen to us culturally. Our culture is going through profound transitions, as we all know. And where it's heading, no one knows for sure. Anyone who thinks they do are really just deluded. But it's during those times you have to find what it is that supports you. One of the most profound things Jung ever said, and I think about this every single day, he said, we all need to find what supports us when nothing supports us. Because the structures, the relationships, the careers, the outer structures that we've depended upon to sort of carry our sense of self and world often can dissolve. I mean, one of the things that people have found in the sequestering, for example, is how much maybe they were dependent upon their work assignment, their job to sort of carry who they were. Those were their marching orders, provisional identity. And when that's disconnected, it falls back upon themselves or upon their family or relationships or so forth. So a lot of folks have been obliged to start, looking at themselves in a new way and beginning to say, all right, what does support me through this journey? Because a lot of the stuff that I took for granted, my work habits, my travels, my distractions, etc., not available to me, that's fallen back and produced all kinds of symptomatology, which all of us, of course, have been dealing with in our therapy sessions for over a year now.
Interesting. Staying with the sort of theme, that sort of the times that we're in, I have a question here from Dr. Zielberg, who's a psychiatrist in Charleston, Dr. Hollis, and he asked, we're in a difficult time in our nation. Politics and psychology are intertwined as always, and our collective shadow is on the loose. In an effort to return unity, calm, and equanimity for all in these United States, what might have Dr. Jung suggested, and what might you suggest attending to both depth psychology and pragmatic issues?
Well, it's extraordinarily complex, and we have to realize, and I'm going to be I'll try to be concise on a very complicated issue here. Those who are so agitated right now are people, by and large, who feel that the world that they have known or that they believe to be solid and stable has dissolved or slipped away. Those who felt that there were certain privileged races, for example, or those who thought there were certain structures that were sort of immutable, or that their socioeconomic circumstances were secure. All of that's changed and dissolved. And it's the natural thing to feel that anxiety. And when people are anxious, they'll want to often lash out at those for whom they feel are responsible. So I think it's a time of encounter, indeed, with our shadow side, with those aspects of our culture and of our presumptions that really need to be examined. We can't say anymore, oh, this is not our country. This is not the country, It's always been this way. It's just in our face one more time. And if you study history, you realize these kinds of things happen repeatedly. But it's also important for all of us, frankly, to stand for the basic principles of this country. I don't have this screen behind me by accident. I live here. I'm 2 miles from the White House right now and 3 miles from the Capitol. And my city right now is an occupied garrison for all the reasons we know. And so that enormous violence that was let out was in due proportion to the anxiety generated by cultural change. We're in one of those in-between times in our culture. Socioeconomic, ethnic changes, racial identity, sexual practice, et cetera, all of those changes destabilize the insecure ego. And whenever it's destabilized, it's going to feel enormous anxiety, and it's going to be often driven to militant ends. But it's a time for the center to come together to talk about our institutions, what we have in common, and to say, all right, you can disagree, but there's certain principles here that we will not allow to be violated. And I think it's going to be a very bumpy year. Someone said to me 2 weeks ago, about January 2nd, oh, it's so good to get out of 20. It's going to be so nice to be in 2021. It's all going to get better. And I said, actually, we have no evidence of that whatsoever. Little did we know what was coming down the pike at us. So this is one of those situations where each of us has to have a sense of a personal core. I've always been drawn to an aphorism from Emily Dickinson, who wrote this at the height of our Civil War. And she was very much aware of the sort of erosion of certain institutions in her lifetime. And she said, the sailor cannot see the north, but knows the needle can. And I think what she was saying there was in difficult times, in murky horizons, you have to have a compass. Do you know you have a compass? How do you consult it? Do you trust it? Are you willing to risk it? And if you have a compass, it can lead you all the way through. And that's part of, again, what's happened during our sequestering. A lot of folks have realized, I don't particularly have a compass. I was being carried by so many of my outer structures, practices, behaviors, and distractions, and so forth. So this is a time for personal accountability and cultural accountability.
Thank you. Another question I have here, and this comes from, I think your book, the audio book, A Life of Meaning. And you talk about, I think you allude to when things fall apart and the role of passages in our lives. And I was wondering if you could discuss the three things that must come through these passages for each of us that you reference, which is keeping our appointment with destiny, reconstructing our maps, and tracking the numinous.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I came back from Zurich 45 years ago, and I began seeing people who had different presenting issues, different family histories, etc., the one thing that was in common to all was that their understanding of self in world, their reflexive responses, for whatever reason, were not working for them. If they had been working, they wouldn't have come to talk to a stranger about it. Their roadmap was no longer applicable to the terrain in which they were finding themselves. So it occurred to me, all right, well, something has died here. Something's played out. Maybe it needs to. And we're in that in-between again, that difficult in-between. That's often what we find in therapy. People come in the in-between because the old understanding and functions, the dependency they had on their marriage or their work situation or whatever, is no longer supportive. And you have to somehow hold fast during those in-between times until the new emerges. But we can't force it to emerge. We just have to, in a sense, hold to ourselves during that time. And of course, part of what therapy is about is supportive structure during that time of sort of fragmentation and decompensation until the new understanding or new orientation to the world emerges. And that word numinous is very important. It comes from a Latin verb that means to nod or beckon. It's like we have to respond to what really speaks to us. When I mentioned that lots of times our old orientation just plays out, it's because maybe we've outlived it, we've outgrown it, or maybe it was never ours in the first place. It's something we received in good faith, perhaps, but received, and we've just exhausted it now. So one of the tests, I think, and it's one of the things I'll be talking about in Charleston this summer, is this touches on the life of our spirituality, and I use that term in the broadest sense here. Which is to say, what is it that really touches you and produces an inner resonance? Let's say two of us walk into an art museum and one person is moved by a painting, another person passes by, almost unaware of its being there. Which person's right? Well, we wouldn't say that was a reasonable question. We would say the numinous, the numinosity of the painting reached someone and caused that resonance. And so where there's resonance, there is the path for life. What speaks to us will meet a response intrapsychically. Give you a very specific example. Many times working with depressed people, and we sort of stumble into or bumble into what's really important for them. And you know, their body lifts, their affect changes, their eyes sparkle. I've often said, look, you're not depressed. Oh yeah, I'm depressed. I'm depressed. Yes, it's like for a moment there, you hit the numinous. For a moment, you had a clue. This is important for you. This is vital for you. You can't invent that, but you need to respond to that. So if we live in response to what is really capable of generating that resonance in us, we'll find our paths through these changes. And if we keep reconstituting the old, it's gonna lead to depression and burnout and self-medication and so forth.
When you are speaking with somebody and they stumble on that numinous, what are some of the things that you do? I guess in terms of from a directional standpoint, when you see that with them in a therapeutic setting.
Well, I certainly underline that and say, notice your response there was not something that was related to your ego control. It was a spontaneous action of your psyche. Because one of the things we have to remember, see, the problem always is the ego thinks it's the boss, thinks it's in charge, when in fact it's often in states of possession by these intrapsychic materials, or simply responding to outer stimuli naturally. And to realize we all have internal guidance systems that we've known since childhood, but we've learned to override, forget about, take for granted. One is the feeling function. You and I do not create feelings. They happen spontaneously. And later they come to conscious awareness. And then we might discard them, anesthetize them, project onto others, ignore them, whatever. But feelings represent autonomous qualitative analyses of what's happening in our life at that particular moment. So if I'm doing all the right things, which happens to so many people, we get a script from our family, religion, all kinds of sources, and you do it to the best of your ability. You've done your job, so to speak, but it never feels right inside. There's no sense of that resonance or satisfaction. That's your own soul speaking. And I'm using the word soul here synonymous with the Greek word psyche, which is what psyche means. We have energy systems. We can mobilize our energy, and we often need to in service to the tasks of life. But ultimately, when you're putting your energy in the wrong places, it leads to exhaustion, boredom, depression, and so on. And yet, when you're doing what's right for you, the energy is always there. It supports you, carries you, and so forth. Thirdly, I work with dreams. We don't create dreams, but some intelligence within us visits us. Sleep research tells us around 6 times per night. Nature does not waste energy. It's producing these autonomous responses to our life. And while they often appear to us opaque and obscure, maybe challenging, mysterious, nonetheless, some intelligence there is trying to communicate with us. We also produce spontaneously symptoms. Most schools of psychology think, oh, well, how quickly do we get rid of the symptoms? Rather, we have to ask the question, why have they come? What are they asking of me? What is the psyche's point of view here? Which is not what we're used to asking. And fifthly, there's something most elusive, but most meaningful of all, and that is itself the question of meaning. Is what you're doing truly meaningful to you? If it is, it allows you to pass through all kinds of suffering, some kinds of tests of your resolve. And if what you're doing is not meaningful to you, you can force your way through it, but there will never be that sense of inner resonance where you know what you're doing is right for you. As Jung said once, the smallest of things with meaning is always greater than the largest of things without meaning. That's why when people project the meaning process onto materialism, let's say, or power, or their children, or whatever, invariably there's a sense of dissatisfaction, disappointment, even anger that occurs. And so the point is, we do not heal, nature heals. And we we're close to those elemental guidance systems of nature when we were children, but because we were tiny, vulnerable, and dependent, we of course had to, adjust to whatever the realities were around us. And it's those adjustments, necessary as they were, that further and further estrange a person from his or her sources of internal guidance. So it's about, at some level, stopping, as I see therapy as a part is stopping and paying attention to these things until you begin to realize there's something in there that is seeking two things: my healing and my growth. And when we can ally our attitudes and choices with that, there's a greater sense. It doesn't spare us conflict, suffering, perhaps even isolation from older structures, but it feels right. And something inside of you knows that. So that's the strange paradox. It's our neuroses. We are the animal that gets separated from itself, the neurotic animal, the sort of wounded creature, if you will. The healing process is reconnecting with the sources of the animal, which is the invigorating sources of our instinctual life that are always there and always trying to speak to us. And one last point about that.
Yeah.
We have our authority as children. It's called instinct. But again, we need to adapt and adjust to whatever is happening in our environment. And so with those trade-offs, we get separated from that. So in so many ways, this is about coming back to your instinctual truths. And in contact with that, living in accord with that, you find your way. We have those guidance systems. And you could see in therapy sometimes the whole sort of problem or task of recovering personal authority shifts from the outer world to whom or to which I have to report every day, progressively to something intrapsychically. And when that happens, there's a healing process that goes on. Healing's a mystery, but we can't cause it, but we can certainly help it in some way.
And sort of target one specific part of that answer, Dr. Hollis, the issue of dreams. Are there some things that therapists, clinicians who maybe are not as well versed or trained in dream work that they can do, let's say, in a clinical setting if somebody brings up the dream? Anything that they might be able to approach that?
Well, certainly. There are some good books on dreams, and there's a program that we have on the Jung Society of Washington website, which you can see. It's an introduction to dreams. And there's an organization called the Jung Platform, which also approaches dreams, have several courses on the subject there, all of which I think are very good. And to realize, I'm 80 years old, and sleep research tells us that if we are privileged to reach 80, we will have spent 6 years of our life dreaming. That's extraordinary. And nature doesn't waste energy, so it's serving a purpose. And there are different kinds of dreams. There are reactive or processing dreams to the stuff of daily life, because more happens every day than we can process. I think part of the function of dreams is to continuing to process the massive stimuli that come to our system, more than we can absorb in the course of our waking life. So there are those kinds of reactive dreams. And too often people stop at that point of, oh, I know what that's about. I saw that on the news last night. Well, the psyche's not obliged to pay attention to what you dealt with on the news last night. But maybe what you encountered there touched on an issue that's important for you. Your psyche's a scavenger. It goes into your history. It goes into popular culture. It goes into the imaginal world and pulls in the images and characters that are going to be germane to its tissue of metaphors. So you have to have some kind of symbolic capacity. If you take the dreams literally, you're going to get into trouble very quickly. There are compensatory dreams where the dream is in some way saying, your conscious life gets too far in this direction. How do you pull back and reorient yourself, bringing this other value or energy into greater position? And then there are archetypal dreams, which are all of us have from time to time. They're dreams that involve us personally, but also in some way are the dreams that speak to humanity as well, or to the life and time that you're in. Jung found both in New Mexico, in the indigenous population, and in various cultures in Africa, they made a distinction between the big dream and this little dream. The little dream was personal. But the big dream was something that was really um, a message to the tribe, if you will. And that the individual who had a big dream, or we would call an archetypal dream, was obliged to somehow share that with the village elders because he or she had just been a vehicle for this communication. So the key thing, though, is not looking to dream dictionaries, most of which are pretty arbitrary and irrelevant. It's really to explore the associations with the dreamer. So I've learned to ask people to read the dream aloud a couple of times because even reading it aloud, you begin to feel the metaphors shimmering in the air, so to speak. And you begin to realize this causes a certain set of associations. Then a person, not always, but much of the time, begins to see, oh yeah, yeah, well, that, this happened over here and that happened over there. And, it's not a science, it's an art. And the more one works with it, the more familiar one begins to get it. I mean, that's a subject for lectures and courses altogether, and I can't do justice to it in just a very brief answer here.
Yeah, well, if we just stay with that for one more second, because I read in one of your books where you talked about that you had a dream when you were in Zurich. I think one of your first sessions in your own analysis, and
Mm-hmm.
it was one of you under attack
Mm-hmm.
in a castle. And I was
Yes.
wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about that, because there seemed to be some really interesting insights that arose from that.
Sure. I'll just mention the first two quickly. My family and I had arrived about 2 weeks before classes started and so forth, and we'd actually visited some castles. So the medieval was very close at hand, as you know. And in this dream, I was standing on the parapet of a castle under siege. And the sky was dark with arrows flying from the field of combat toward the castle. And I felt extraordinary anxiety. Will this castle hold? Will this castle hold? And at the edge of the battlefield was the beginning of a forest, and I could see that a witch figure. What's a witch doing in the 20th century in Zurich, Switzerland? Home of all those banks. I don't know, but there she was. It was very clear, and she was directing the assault, and it ended with that sense of stress and anxiety. And that was my first dream I took to analysis in Zurich. And my analyst said, well, let's lower the drawbridge and go out and meet her. And we began a technique called active imagination, where you reactivate the image and engage in it, allow its autonomy while holding your ego position and begin to engage in a dialogue. So I remember thinking, well, I've come this far, in for a penny, in for a pound, I guess. But I was also thinking, are you crazy? She's trying to kill me, right? I was very much aware of that ambiguity at that moment. But I went out into this battlefield, and as I got closer, she started going like this, pulling me into the forest. I remember thinking, boy, I'm in real trouble now. So it was the beginning. And then she took me into the forest and showed me this book of symbols. And then it was over. It was like the movie is over. And I realized it was an invitation to a journey. That book looked fascinating, though I couldn't understand any of those symbols at that point. The second dream followed the same week, in which, and we had also gone to Berchtesgaden, the former retreat of Hitler at the end of World War II. And in the dream, I'm in an underground bunker, which we'd actually explored into the mountain there. And I've lost my child, who at the time was between 8 and 9 with me. And as any parent would be, I ran out into the village and I was panicky. I went to the fire department, the police department, the religious institution, the school. Nobody could help me. And then I sort of wandered disconsolately into the forest again. And there I saw this figure growing out of the ground with his body was a tree trunk. And he was this barrel figure. And he said, I will help you find your child. That was the end of the dream. And I knew the truth of that. Now, there's a whole lot of symbolism there. I don't have time to unpack here. But we'd also traveled in the Black Forest and seen those same images there. that the people who've lived there for centuries have understood that there were, so to speak, spirits in the forest, and their job was to sort of carve that away and let those figures emerge out of their trees, you know. So I'd had these really primal dreams to start with, both of which were frightening. Both of them constituted an invitation. Both of them were the beginning of a journey I couldn't quite imagine. But both of them in the end were profound in the sense that they were numinous. I knew I had to go forward with these. And of course, that child that was lost, played by my son in the dream, was an aspect of myself left behind when I was 8 or 9 years old. And to go back metaphorically and pick up what got left behind there is part of that healing process. Now, we don't make this stuff up consciously. I mean, from time to time, I wondered myself, what is this? But we have to say, you know, this is real. People dream these things. And when you track it over time, things begin to emerge. A different kind of conversation rises out of this. And then you've engaged in a kind of death dialogue with the meaning of your own journey. And you become a participant in it rather than simply a person to whom it's happening.
Fascinating. Thank you, Dr. Hollis. I have a question that came in here. And it says, in analytical psychology, there's saying that the opposite of any truth is always also true. Would you explain the meaning behind this and its implications?
Sure. And you spoke about that a great deal, but basically, simple issues have resolution, this or that. The most important issues of life are always paradoxical. There's always two sides, and both are true at some level. The great truths always involve a contradiction. So the shadow was mentioned in one of the inquiries before. The shadow represents those parts of ourselves that we really don't want to look at in ourselves. And, you know, we don't want to look at our vanity or our pettiness or our jealousy, but they're there because we're not exempt from the human project. And they'll show up in life, but it also represents our unlived life. It represents our joy, our spontaneity, our creative process. So you can see there that the encounter with that which is rejected by the ego or distanced from the ego because it asks something that is complicated and difficult for the ego structure is nonetheless vital to that healing process. Or we can say there's constantly in the field of intimate relationship, the push-pull. What can I reasonably ask of my partner? And what do I need to ask of myself? You know, that's a paradox, you see. A mature relationship is one in which I say, you know, if I can identify what I really need to address myself, then I'm lifting that off of my partner. If I don't ask that question, I'm continuously dumping it on my partner or my children. One of the things I mentioned in an earlier book, Living the Examined Life, a chapter that's stuck in the throat of an awful lot of people, I can tell you, is one of the tasks of the second half of life is to free your children from you. Because we all know how much time we spend in therapy trying to unravel the person's journey from whatever happened in the parent-child relationships. And yet parents themselves often project their unlived life onto their children. You are going to make me feel good about myself. You're going to carry this on, or you're going to validate and ratify my values by showing up with similar values. Surprisingly, you're going to turn out like me. I mean, that's in the sort of grab bag of every parent, and the unconscious parent will be very destructive in imposing that on a child, thinking I'm doing the right thing for the child, when in fact it's all our unexamined life. So again, everything that really matters in life and really matters in therapy is going to be paradoxical, meaning there's always something there that is valuable. For example, we used the term passages before. Every passage is a death. Well, the ego doesn't like that. It's not thrilled. And yet, how does nature clear the way without that death, so to speak? How is the new ever going to arrive? How do we ever grow up? How do we How do we mature? How do we move through the stages of our journey if something doesn't have to die first? So there's the paradox there, that out of death comes new life. But for new life to occur, death must occur. That's a classic paradox there. It's the death and rebirth motif at work within us. So I think, it's the ego that wants to say, but life was supposed to be simple, right? We're supposed to be able to figure it out, get the right instructions, right roadmap, and walk into some sunlit meadow where conflict is behind us, all is clear, and everybody's, happy with things. Well, dream on. That's not realistic. That's not the nature of our own psyche. And the more we cling to that fantasy, the more disillusioned and disappointed we'll be. The critical piece of psychological development is the capacity to live with ambiguity. The moment that the ego experiences ambiguity, it's going to feel threatened. That's why I mentioned this with regard to our national discords. And the mature psyche can handle change and transition and deal with the tension of opposites. The immature and most threatened egos can't. And that's when, there's the disruption that we have at this moment. So again, paradox is the only way of expressing the complexity of life. And every time I think I've figured it out, I've gotten one-sided. So my own psyche is going to show up somewhere over here symptomatically, trying to bring me back into some kind of differing balance.
And so what does it look like if somebody comes to you? Obviously, there's this element of, I do this very well, but something's not right, that you had kind of referenced.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe they have gotten in touch with certain things that maybe speak to their soul where they need to be. But again, there's still this victimization versus the engagement piece of it. I don't have the money to do this, or I don't have the time, or I have all these responsibilities. And this is, I guess, the stuckness element that you're referring to. How do you help somebody move forward
Mm-hmm.
from that?
Well, first of all, you referenced there a statement I actually learned from one of my clients in Houston a number of years ago, who was a long-term member of AA. And he said one of the sayings of his group was, this isn't working for me, but I do it very well. I thought that's a lovely sentence. I could apply to all of us in all circumstances. My systems aren't working so well, but I'm very adept at doing them. So there has to be that some sense of bankruptcy, some sense of exhaustion before we really began to sort of say, all right, I have to let go of that, relinquish that somehow. But out of that, what's going to emerge? You see, where do you go from there? And I think everyone has, in the first half of life, you can say your basic summons is, to develop enough ego to step out onto the playground, to deal with your parents, to deal with a school teacher, to step out into the world and say to an employer, hire me, you can trust me to show up and do the job. And relationship, trust me, I'm going to meet you halfway on these things. But then why are we here after age 35 or 40? Then you have to say, that's been a dialogue between the ego and the world. Now there's time for an ego and the soul. Why am I here really? Rather than being just a socioeconomic unit or a vehicle for the renewal of the species or whatever, why am I here? What is wanting to enter the world through me? That raises the question of vocation. What am I called to do? I'm not talking just about job. It could lead to a change in career, certainly, but that's too literalistic at the moment. It's more about what is seeking expression through me? And then the ego is, again, brought back into a dialogue with the transcendent other that is intrapsychic. When we do, that's in some way a spiritual project. The first is a social project. The second is a spiritual project because it's really dealing with, the mystery of our being here in the first place. Why am I here? In service to what? If I don't ask those questions in some fashion, I'm going to be on automatic pilot or simply responding to the strongest stimuli in my environment, which is often what the case may be. But at the same time, when I look at these things intrapsychically, then I realize something there is summoning me to an accountability. That word that we use so often, accountability, is increasingly an important word for me because it says I need to be accountable for what is really seeking that expression, or I need to be accountable for, if I'm not being accountable, look what's spilling into the world through me and producing consequences out there in the world, my children and others. And also discernment. Discernment's another important word. We're bombarded with traffic constantly. It's busier than O'Hare Airport or Hartsfield-Jackson at rush hour. All right, which of those threads are appropriate to respond to? Which are the archaic messages of childhood? Which are the, bombardments of the commercial world and so forth? And which voices come from my own soul? And that discernment process has to go on continuously. And that's why observing these other elemental functions, like the feeling function, the energy systems, meaning, dreams, etc., help us along the way to do that discernment process. Because if we're tracking what's right for us, we feel the support within, even if life is difficult and conflictual. And when we don't have that, life is a mess. It's a journey. As Jung put it very modestly once, he said, without that engagement, life goes less well. And we all know about that.
In this idea of the archaic messages of childhood that you just referenced there, I think it kind of relates to the question that somebody just sent me, which is, what do you mean by the concept of storying our world and the problems we all face with this phenomenon?
Sure. Well, here are the animal who needs meaning at all costs. We can't live meaningless lives. And this begins in infancy, begins in childhood. What happened? Who are you? Who am I? What's this about? And all the collateral questions that go with that. Are you reliable? Can I trust that you're going to be there? Are you warm and supportive and inviting? Are you withholding? Are you punitive? And who am I in this mix? We're asking large questions, even as tiny babies and toddler children, about what's going on here. What's the world about? What am I to do here? And what am I in myself? Am I valuable or, should I hide out? Can I ask for something? Those elemental questions are inherent to our species. And we begin to story them in the sense that we develop splinter narratives. The child couldn't understand that maybe the remoteness or the angers, let's say, of a parent were never about me. They were because their life is not going so well at the time. They're exhausted. They're troubled. Okay, I don't know that. As an infant, as a toddler, as a child, I internalize all of that. It's being about me. That's why we take on the kind of messages of our world. We're constantly reading the world as a statement to us about ourselves. This is how children get shamed by poverty and racism, sexism, alcoholism, abuse, etc. None of which had to do with the worth and weight of their own souls. But we story it nonetheless. And then the problem is we become prisoners of our stories. The stories that help us try to make sense of our world and even give us some coping strategies where we sort of can approach it or run from it or stay out of harm's way, whatever the behaviors that are attached to these archaic stories. Those become core complexes. You've all heard the word complex. The complex is a neutral word, but you have to start then saying, all right, it's a structure of energy that's loaded with energy and has a script and has a story attached to it. And when it's triggered, it has the power to usurp the ego, pull us out of this time and place, and put us back into the field of energy that was prevalent at the time of its formation. So that's why it's rare at some level to be in this moment, truly, because this moment is so flooded by the materials of the past. And this is what leads to our repetitions. I've often said to people, if you want to start your personal analysis, and you don't need a therapist for this, start with your patterns, because your patterns are revealing of those kinds of stories operating intrapsychically and autonomously in your life, particularly the ones you find troubling to you producing bad consequences, maybe harmful to others, and then work backwards and say, all right, what we do is logical based on the premise of the story. We don't do crazy things, we do logical things. I gave you tons of examples of what seems to be crazy behavior. But if you look at the intrapsychic premise, you realize it's a logical response to that. And then you work backwards, and that's how you begin to make that invisible world visible. The problem with the unconscious is it's unconscious. So by definition, we can't talk about it, but we have to be able to work from the visible world back into the invisible world. And one of the places to start are those patterns, or those places where maybe people get into our face and say, you know, what you did was just hurtful to me or something like that. And no matter what we think about it or whatever rationalization we might have, we have to take that very seriously and say that, in a sense, came from one of those, quote, stories in there. So think of a story, a psychological story is essentially a child's interpretation of the world based on a child's capacity to understand, which is why we sometimes encounter that paradox later in therapy. Strange paradox that what happened to you and what may have governed your life strategy up to this point was never about you. It was about someone else's problem or the intercession of fate. And it wasn't about you. What is truly in you is wishing its own free expression, unencumbered by that story. And frankly, that's a lifetime work, because no matter how tall the structure may be, you know, the elevator always has to go through the bottom floors to get to the top. So we're always in some way processing these archaic stories and playing out in the field of our relationships, or how we respond to our work environment or to our children or whatever. This is why this work is an ongoing work. It's a lifetime work. It can only be addressed with a measure of discipline and a measure of attentiveness and a certain willingness to be instructed, to realize there are things going on inside of each of us of which we know virtually nothing. And yet it keeps spilling into the world. And when we do that, we become potentially less problematic to others. And frankly, we have a very interesting story unfolding. I've often said to people, this is not about cure, but it's about making your life more interesting. And I submit to you, that's a very profound gift, that you realize that every day, high drama going on in here. Rising from the pillow in the morning, I face the world, confronting, first of all, fear and lethargy, the world that says, hey, it's too big out here, you can't handle it, try to find a way to hide out today. Lethargy that says, pull a blanket over your head, have some chocolate, and turn on Oprah. You know, those are intrapsychic enemies. They have nothing to do with out there. They're all in here, and I've got to face that first. But then I have to enter the world as it is, and I'm going to be less capable of coping with it and living with any integrity, to the degree that I'm more governed by those autonomous stories, and to the degree I've not been able to identify my own sources of support and direction, and to the degree I've not yet discovered what we all have, and that's what Emily Dickinson said, is the compass within that helps us chart our way through the dark wood.
Yeah, I'm reminded, I think you had mentioned something about, I don't know if it was Marcus Aurelius or whatever it was that inspired you, where you have some statements that you think about every morning as you sort of get up
Sure.
from that pillow. I don't know if you could share that with folks.
Well, I'm moved by a passage in the journal of Marcus Aurelius, who's out there in the, in the wilderness about to fight for his life. And here's the emperor. He could be back at the palace having a good time. And he says, basically, this is the task you've been born to. Don't grumble. Be privileged. This is your task. So address it. So I've developed a personal 6-word motto, which I say to myself, and any one of you can utilize it if you want. And briefly, it's this: shut up, suit up, show up. Shut up says, I'm talking to me now, not anybody else. I'm not being impolite. Shut up says to me, stop whining. You're lucky. You're privileged. There are people out there who have no food. There are people out there who don't have a roof over their head. There are people out there whose children are being killed. So you don't have any problems, the problems you think are trivial. Shut up. Speaking myself again. Secondly, suit up, prepare, do what you need to do. Don't expect life to make it easy. Prepare, work hard, show up, meaning just do the best you can. The old saying, life's difficult and then you die. Well, yeah, but the real trick is this life meaningful to you? If it is, you'll know it. If it is, everything inside of you will confirm it. And if it isn't, something inside will revolt. And that's what brings people to therapy, is that revolt. And to show up means none of us get it right. None of us are perfect. Perfection is a terrible complex to labor with. It's like you do your best and extend a little grace and forgiveness to yourself. I find the most difficult thing maybe is to forgive myself. I expect better of myself, but grace is, as Paul Tillich said, accept the fact that you're accepted despite the fact that you're unacceptable. There's the paradox again. I am a person who is trying to be accountable, and I'm not always on target, and I do stupid things and counterproductive things, and all I can do is come back to the table and try to do it better the next time. So shut up, suit up, show up.
Thanks. And we're getting close to the end here. I'm not going to get anywhere near all the questions here. So I guess maybe in closing, Dr. Hollis, I don't know if there's anything that you might want to say about your newest book coming up, Prisms. I don't know if you can share anything with us, some context around that might be great.
Well, it's a series of 11 essays written very recently. And there are two in particular I might mention to our folks today. There's a chapter in there, which is the first time I've written out the program I've done to tons of groups of therapists before, called The Wounded Healer, that explores our what drives us to this work, what sets us up for further injury, the stresses and burnouts and things we can do to help ourselves, and why it's such a wonderful calling at the same time. So that's one of the essays in there. And in fact, I think the first time I spoke for your conference, I spoke on that, but it was just in the oral version at that time. So I've written that out. And there's a chapter in there on a sort of reframing one's sense of self and world as a result of the virus. And I think that can be useful to not ourselves, but to our clients as well. And there's also a chapter in there on comedy, which I think is important to have in the balancing system. It's full of good jokes. It's full of bad jokes. And why do we laugh? And what does comedy tell us about the nature of the human spirit? And how is it such a profound reaction to the otherwise tragic dimensions of human existence? So it's a compilation of essays on creativity, narcissism, the personal myth, the problem of evil, a lot of varied subjects, and that's out in a month or so.
Right. Well, I appreciate it. And I think we're just about out of time. Dr. Hollis, I really appreciate the opportunity and the conversation. Thank you so much for that. Looking forward to seeing you this summer. And just a couple things to close out on. A lot of people have asked Dr. Hollis about getting your books, and certainly there are many ways to do that. I would ask that you take a look at Buxton Books, which has access to many of them, and they're here in Charleston, and you could look them up online for that. And then CEs was another question that was raised in terms of getting continuing education credits. We will send to everybody who registered just a feedback form, and then also the certificate via email. So don't worry about that. You'll be taken care of with that. And then please do remember, go to lowcountrymhconference.com and register for the conference this summer. We're really looking forward to having missed it last year. And we would love to have you join us again. Next month, in March 15th, will be our next Speaker Spotlight series, and that will be with Drs. Jürgen Kremer and Dr. Bayo Akomalafe, who will be joining us together as a duo, which should be a lot of fun. So again, Dr. Hollis, thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone for joining us, and take care. The Lowcountry Mental Health Conference is a fundraising event. The money that we raise for you attending the conference goes directly to clinical care here in the Charleston metro area to address mental health issues.
The setting here is just so amazing and huge, and when you go into the theater, it feels like a really big deal.
What differentiates this conference from many others is the quality of the speakers that we have, world-renowned mental health professionals, but also getting unique perspectives from artists, philosophers, again, world-renowned across the globe.
The best experience for me at the conference was probably going in the exhibit hall, where there were, I think, 75 different sponsors and exhibitors that I could network with.
The musical performances were excellent. I had the opportunity to see Edwin McCain pretty close up, and it just moved me to tears. He really connected with the audience. He's a supporter of mental health and shared personal stories, as well as, we all got a break and got to listen to some fabulous music.
I think this conference surprises a lot of people who attend. It's innovative, they're incredible speakers, and we have all of them combined in 2 days. And these are folks that people have read or studied in graduate school.
You should not miss this conference. The quality of the speakers, the venue, the location, it's an excellent experience, one not to be missed.
This conference is a great opportunity to see so many different speakers, be in a great city, great location. You gotta come.
I would definitely come again to this conference. It was fabulous. I'll be here every year.
I absolutely would come again, on my calendar right now.
I would really come again. This is my 4th conference. It gets better every year here in Charleston.
I encourage you not to miss this conference if you're a mental health professional. It is truly a gem here on the East Coast that happens every year here in beautiful Charleston, South Carolina. It'll be transformative in terms of your clinical practice and the skills that you'll learn from some of the very best professionals and experts in the field today.